Welcome back to Sustainable Sense, and today I want to try something a little bit interesting. Chat with me while I have a snack. Specifically popcorn from a local organic farm and coconut water from a bee-certified company. So, let's be real for a second. How long have you gone without eating a piece of steak, a hamburger from your favorite restaurant, or a dinosaur chicken nugget? 1 day? 2? None? I bet we can change that. Welcome to Sustainable Sense, where we invest in climate defense. You're in for our hot take on all things money, markets, and the environment. So today, I'm going to try to convince you to go vegetarian, as hard as it may be. As a quick disclaimer, this is not me attempting to force my opinions on you or forever change your eating habits. I'm also not a dietitian or anything professional, so please take this episode with a grain of salt, and I just hope you learn something out of it. So yes, today, I'm going to try to convince you to go vegetarian. Not just because it's good for the planet, not just because it's good for you, but because it's smart economics, and potentially one of the smartest decisions we can make as individuals and as a global society. And no, this episode is not about steamed tofu recipes. It's an episode about trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, and a surprisingly powerful economic lever sitting on your plate. Reason number 1, you should go vegetarian. Let's cut to the chase here. Raising livestock is one of the main contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions, more than all transportation sectors combined. Estimates of livestock's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions vary, ranging from 12 to 20% of the global total, mostly in the form of methane from ruminants like cows and sheep, and carbon dioxide released when forests are cut down for pasture. A single cow produces roughly 154 to 264 pounds of methane per year. Methane, which is emitted in cow burps and manure, is a short-lived greenhouse gas that is 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide over 20 years, making it one of the few available levers to prevent climate tipping points being reached in the near term. By one estimate, a complete phase-out of meat over 15 years would cut as much as 1/3 of all methane emissions and 2/3 of all nitrous oxide emissions. Water use would fall drastically, biodiversity loss would slow, and there would be ample opportunity to rewild abandoned rangelands and pastures at scale that would sequester a whole lot of carbon. As much as 550 gigatons, enough to give us a pretty good shot at keeping warming below catastrophic levels. And if everyone became vegetarian by 2050, food-related emissions would drop by 60%. Meat alternatives, on the other hand, generate up to 90% fewer emissions. They also use a fraction of the land and water use. According to recent analysis, switching to plant-based diets globally could free up about a quarter of the world's habitable land that is currently dominated by cattle grazing or growing grain to feed cattle. That space we could use for rewilding, afforestation, or simply feeding people. So let that sink in. 1/4 of the world's land. Reason number 2, and here's where the numbers get really staggering. Right now, 40% of global grain production goes to livestock. In wealthier nations, that number could rise to 70%. That means 7 out of 10 bushels of corn, wheat, and soybeans don't go to feed people. They go to feed animals, which we then eat. If any of you out there took environmental science, you would know that in the food pyramid, only about 10% of the energy from crops is passed to the livestock that eat it. That's incredibly inefficient food system. You could be gaining so much energy and so much more available land space if crop production was redirected for human consumption. In fact, experts say if we did that, we could feed an additional 3.5 billion people. That's more than enough to end world hunger. In financial terms, this isn't just a moral imperative, it's a colossal economic inefficiency. The FAO, or the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, estimates global hunger costs over $3 trillion per year in lost productivity, healthcare burdens, and social instability. By freeing up grains for direct human consumption, we strengthen global economies, improve international food security, and stabilize prices, especially important for low-income countries that are disproportionately affected by commodity shocks. Reason number 3. Let's talk about resources. Raising livestock, first of all, is heavily water intensive, especially when you're raising them on CAFOs or other feedlots. You need water not only to hydrate the animals, but to also grow their feed. Beef, for example, is an incredibly inefficient food source. It takes over 2,500 gallons of water, 12 pounds of grain, 35 pounds of topsoil, and the energy equivalent of 1 gallon of gasoline just to produce 1 pound of feedlot beef. Compare that to lentils or beans, and we're talking orders of magnitude less. Switching to a vegetarian diet reduces your water footprint on average by about 50%. And then there's waste. Livestock operations produce massive amounts of manure. In the US alone, factory farms generate over 500 million tons of animal waste per year. That's more than the entire human population generates. These manure lagoons leach into groundwater, create toxic runoff, and can eventually create hypoxic environments and contribute to dead zones in our oceans. Those same lagoons often contain antibiotics, hormones, disinfectants, and trace chemicals used in industrial farming. These substances enter the soil and waterways, where they bioaccumulate up into plants, aquatic life, and ultimately us. Over time, these residues can disrupt ecosystems, affect reproductive health in wildlife, and even human workers, and increase human exposure to drug-resistant bacteria and hormone disruptors. And when you clear forests to make way for grazing, you're not just losing trees. You're damaging topsoil, losing the ability to sequester carbon, disrupting local rainfall cycles, and releasing centuries of stored carbon. At least 75% of this deforestation is attributed to agricultural activities. The primary catalyst behind global deforestation is beef production, with the conversion of land for cattle grazing and feed production accounting for approximately 41% of deforestation, equivalent to about 2.1 million hectares annually, roughly half the size of the Netherlands. This equates to over 16.4 million trees lost each day as a result of animal agriculture. And why does this matter exactly? Deforestation contributes to loss of carbon sequestration, gradual but deadly increases in global temperature, loss of biodiversity and productive environments that support entire health and well-being of ecosystems, forced migration of hundreds of species who may not be able to move, increased risk of soil erosion and flooding or mudslides, and deterioration of indigenous communities. Though these effects snowball together, they are nonetheless important. So, it's not just about carbon emissions. It's about soil integrity, freshwater supply, food stability, and long-term resilience, all of which have very real environmental and economic costs when they collapse. Reason number 4. Let's bring this argument a bit closer to home. Literally, to your body and your bank account. According to the CDC and Harvard researchers, chronic diseases tied to diet, such as heart disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and some cancers, cost the US over $1 trillion annually in medical expenses and lost productivity. So, what does that have to do with meat? A study by the University of Oxford of nearly 475,000 UK adults indicated that higher consumption of unprocessed red meat and processed meat combined was associated with higher risks of ischemic heart disease, pneumonia, diverticular disease, colon polyps, and diabetes. For instance, every 70 grams higher red meat and processed meat intake per day was associated with a 15% higher risk of ischemic heart disease and a 30% higher risk of diabetes. A study published in the PNAS, or the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, modeled dietary shifts in the US. It found that if we fully switched to a plant-based economy, we could save $250 billion per year in healthcare savings. But the benefits go beyond dollars. The same study estimates 320,000 lives could be saved each year with a plant-based diet. That's like saving every resident of St. Louis every single year. And finally, reason 5. The question at the heart of the ethical debate over vegetarianism is this. Are we justified in raising and killing animals for food when equally nutritious plant-based food is readily available? Let's break down this moral dilemma in 3 ways. Peter Singer argues that sentient beings, or those capable of suffering and pleasure, deserve equal consideration of their interests. Since meat production inherently causes animals harm without necessity, ethical vegetarianism is morally required under utilitarian principles. And no, plants don't count in this. While they do respond to stimuli, they lack nervous systems and brains, which is why animals, unlike plants, can and do feel pain. Tom Regan contends that animals, like humans, have inherent value and moral rights because they are conscious subjects of life. Treating them as commodities, as factory farming does, violates those rights and is inherently unjust, which is different from the natural circle of life. From this perspective, vegetarianism isn't just a choice. It could be a moral obligation rooted in respect for all sentient beings. And lastly, factory farming essentially institutionalizes cruelty on a staggering scale. Animals are crammed into cages and stalls so small they can barely turn around, stripped of any chance to express natural behaviors. Many endure routine mutilations without pain relief. Chickens have their beaks seared off to prevent stress-induced pecking, while cows and pigs have their tails docked or horns removed. These animals are bred for unnatural size or growth rates, leading to crippling health issues like organ failure. And in the final moments of their lives, slaughterhouses push through animals at such relentless speeds that many are improperly stunned, meaning that they're still conscious as they're cut open. This type of farming is systematically built on maximizing output. Of course, not all farms are like this, but sadly, most are. So at this point, you probably have a lot of questions. Won't the complete negative supply shock in livestock hurt regional economies and cultures, put people out of work, cost so much to transition to a plant-based economy, and not give me as much protein as I need, etc., etc.? Well, you're partially right and partially wrong. This is the same kind of concept if we wondered what would happen if we got rid of all fossil fuels right now. So firstly, you're wondering, won't this hurt the economy? In the short term, yes, a global shift to vegetarianism could shrink GDP by about 1%, especially in regions reliant on meat exports. But long term, the composition of the economy would shift, not shrink. We could gain new jobs and markets in plant-based innovation and sustainable farming, expansion of land restoration, carbon sequestration, and regenerative agriculture, massive cuts in healthcare spending and insurance payouts, increased food security and reduced price volatility, and resilience to climate shocks and supply chain disruptions. When you consider externalities such as all those hidden environmental and health costs, meat isn't cheap. Those negative effects just aren't priced in to the cost. The consumer isn't paying the real price, essentially. The public is. In economic terms, eating meat is a subsidized inefficiency. Let's zoom out for a second. The global meat and livestock industry is worth around $1.4 trillion. That's a big number, but a lot of that value depends on government support. Around the world, governments spend over $500 billion a year in subsidies for things like livestock feed and farming. Basically, our tax dollars are helping keep meat prices lower than they really are. Now, if we put a carbon tax on livestock, meaning charging farms for the greenhouse gases they release, just like some countries do for power plants, experts estimate it could add $300 to $400 billion a year in extra cost to the industry. Meat would get more expensive and plant-based foods would become the better deal. That's a basic market correction, making sure the prices we pay match the real cost to the planet and public health. Now, secondly, you may be thinking it'd be very costly to transition to a completely plant-based economy, especially for low-income neighborhoods who rely on access to meat. Well, an Oxford research study found that vegan diets were the most affordable and reduced food costs by up to 1/3 in countries like US and UK. Vegetarian diets were a close second, and flexitarian diets with low amounts of meat and dairy reduced costs by 14%. For those with only access to cheap meat options, turning vegetarian may not be the most sustainable solution for them. We also recognize that meat may be ingrained in certain cultures and respect their sustainable consumption. Once that consumption turns to mass-produced commercialization, that's when problems start happening. So for those who are capable, dietary-wise and economic-wise, it may be a smart option. And finally, for you gym buffs out there, it is very possible to get the same amount of protein and not give up the feel of eating meat. Have you seen all those meatless wings and nugget recipes online with the barbecue sauce and all the fix-ins? So to obtain a protein-rich comparable meal as a meat eater, vegetarians can focus on incorporating protein-rich plant-based foods into their diet. So this includes things like legumes, nuts and seeds, soy products, whole grains, and dairy or dairy alternatives if you're following a vegan diet. Vegetarian food, particularly when well-planned, can be more nutritious than meat in several ways. Vegetarian diets tend to be lower in saturated fat and cholesterol and higher in fiber, vitamins, and antioxidants, potentially leading to a reduced risk of heart disease and some cancers. Yet, it's important to make sure you are not deficient in certain vitamins and minerals by doing routine checkups. So, what is the solution to this whole thing? I totally understand that while switching right off the bat to vegetarianism or even veganism is quite hard, small transitions or wide scale can make the difference. Try cutting out all beef and pork from your diet for a week and see where it takes you. Try meatless Mondays and flexitarian Fridays. If this consistency is kept up on a wide scale, demand for such products can drastically decrease, driving down the equilibrium quantity and price. This will inherently reduce the quantity supplied by producers and get us closer to our economic and environmental solutions. So, have I answered all your questions? If not, feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to chat some more. As someone who is a vegetarian personally, I can tell you wholeheartedly that there are so many delicious and filling food options to try. So let's recap the value proposition. We can save up to $250 billion in healthcare, free up 25% of Earth's land, cut water use in half, feed 3.5 billion more people, slow deforestation and restore soil, reduce food costs by 16%, shrink your personal carbon footprint by up to 73%, curb antibiotic resistance and hormone contamination, and reduce waste streams and chemical runoff, all by going vegetarian. So, has this episode worked to convince you? If so, share this episode with someone on the fence about vegetarianism and give us a follow. And if not, you should still totally give us a follow. You can find us on LinkedIn and Instagram at sustainablecentspodcast. If you have any questions or episode suggestions, you can email us at sustainablecentspodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's sustainablecentspodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this is your host, signing off. And as always, invest your sense in climate defense.